Hi, and I'm glad that you're continuing to come through our Knowledge Center and try to learn more about what it means to buy security consulting and what security consulting should offer for you. The question we're going to talk about today is how are findings risk rate ranked? This is one of the questions that we hear quite often because, there's so many things out there in the industry, CVSS, CVE, CWE, lots of different types of risk rankings and names and scores and what have you. Secure Ideas doesn't use those scores to do our own risk ranking. Now, let me be very clear. We can provide those scores for our findings. We can help work with you to ensure that you understand those scores. But for us, what we have found is that most of the time, those scorecards are quantitative. They try to run some fuzzy math and tell you what your risk is. And really, what we want is qualitative scores, right? Because when you look at those math formulas, what you find is that underlying them is just a qualitative score. Somebody said, I think this is this bad, right? And so what we do is we came up with, and I want to be very clear, this is very industry standard, right? We look at the finding and we base it on our experience, the consultant's experience, and our understanding of the organization and the business that organization is in. And then we evaluate them and designate it as critical, high, medium, or low. And we've got three aspects that affect that. The potential threats that are out there, the possible impact of successful exploitation would have, and the likelihood of attack. So let's talk a little bit about potential threats, right? So we look out and try to determine, how much expertise would it need to leverage that flaw? Who would be trying to leverage that flaw? Is it an outside attacker? Is it an inside attacker? Is it a disgruntled employee? What have you? How well do they know the system? And how much knowledge do you need to do the attack? And how good is your understanding, or how much understanding of the mechanism of attack is possible? Then we try to determine what the likelihood of attack is, right? We look at the types of things like attacker motivations based on what we've talked about and looked at and worked with. We also look at the complexity of the attack vector and mitigating controls that you may have. And then finally, we look at each finding and we try to determine if it was exploited, what's the potential for damage, right? What is the possible impact to the organization? And we take those three things and then we build them together to determine what level is this risk, right? And like I said, we start with critical, high, medium, and low. Now, some pen testing companies, consulting companies will also put out there an informational level. We don't do informational levels. If we have information for you, we provide it to you. It's just not part of the report. And we find that the reason for that is that many times when we give you a report, if we gave you informational level findings, auditors and other people who are looking at that report are going to have way more questions about those informational findings than they're really worth. And so we just don't include those. Critical is something that we believe is actively being exploited in the wild, right? And I don't mean, oh, hey, there is an exploit for that. I mean, it's actively being attacked right now. Maybe there's a worm spreading that is using that exploit. Or your system that we found the vulnerability in has signs of exploitation. A test, one of the very first tests I did as Secure Ideas, we found a vulnerability and found proof that an attacker had used it and was dumping system. A critical finding is something we're going to write it up in the report, but we are also going to immediately stop testing and contact the client for further instructions. And I say immediately, we're going to do it as soon as we possibly can, right? Because sometimes we're going to stop testing and then we reach out to you and it might take an hour for you to answer the call, which is a different problem, right? But a critical finding is we stop and we call you to let you know what's going on. We might email you, we might send it to you via Slack, depending on the communication path you, the client organization, has chosen. The next one is high risk. These are vulnerabilities that have a pretty good likelihood that somebody's going to exploit them. They also have a significant impact on business, right? If that is exploited, how bad does it affect you, right? When we look at these, very often high-risk findings, similar to critical risk findings, they require an immediate attention to some type of protection, maybe a temporary protection. For example, maybe you limit the IP addresses that are able to get to that system very rapidly so that you've lowered the accessibility to the vulnerability. Then we have medium. And medium are ones that quite often they may not be significant by themselves, right? But they contribute to a more significant breach. Or they are bad, but there's other controls in place that are preventing significant compromise of your system. And then finally, we see things that are in the low-risk categories. And this is something that is probably not directly exploitable. Maybe it is, but probably not. Or it's very limited. Like we see some things where we find a vulnerability, and really the vulnerability would be very bad, but there's only 2 people in the organization that have access to that system, and the system is monitored like crazy. Okay, that's a lower risk vulnerability, right? Now, something I want to point out, and any penetration testing company that you work with should offer the same exact process. As we talk about in some of our other articles about pen testing and the process we follow and what have you, we deliver what we call a draft report. Now, we don't mean that it has spelling errors and bad grammar. It may, I would hope not, but I'm not perfect. But it's draft insofar as we're looking for feedback from you based on your understanding of your organization as to whether or not these risk levels are correct. We believe they're right based on our understanding, but we give you the drafts so that you can provide that feedback. We're going to discuss it and then possibly modify the risk level before we generate the final report. Thank you very much. I hope this was helpful. I hope you enjoy the article. And as you explore the Knowledge Center, feel free to reach out with any questions or comments that you may have. Maybe you'll see another article based on your question.